Whether the weapons from Warlord's Ruin is potent or not, you can't deny that Bungie's being creative here. Today we're going to be looking at the first of its kind, a legendary sidearm called Indebted Kindness. Now this weapon is a rocket-assisted sidearm that takes special ammo. Now I don't know what it is, Bungie starts to get pretty weird when they start getting into sidearms, even back in Destiny 1 with Drake's Promise. But Bungie has always been a bit more bold when it came to sidearms. Here recently we have the new Exotic, which is like a sidearm crossbow hybrid. But I would argue and say that Indebted Kindness is even stranger, being this rocket-assisted sidearm. Now we were actually first shown this weapon during the reveal showcase for the final shape. For some reason, we're getting it early. Now listen, I'm not going to complain about getting stuff early. It is strange to me because Dragon's Breath was also shown to us to be coming in final shape, yet it was the season pass exotic for this season. But regardless of why we are getting this loot early or not, today we're going to be reviewing this sidearm because I think when we first picked it up, we kind of just thought, all right, is that it? But as we began to play with it more and more, it really started to show us how lethal this baby is. Now, Indebted Kindness is an arc sidearm. It fires at 100 rounds per minute. And as mentioned, it's the first of a brand new archetype called Rocket Assisted Frame, which reads, sidearm fires self-propelled rocket ammunition. Projectiles explode on impact for high damage. Now, unfortunately, this weapon is still not in the API yet. Who knows, maybe by the time this video comes out, it will be. I would love to sit down though and compare stats, but let's be real. Compare it to what, right? Like what will we actually compare this sidearm to? It's a rocket sidearm, because name me another sidearm that has blast radius or a velocity stat. Dude, no lie, this gets even weirder. But there's a reason why people are calling it the pocket rocket, for his and her pleasure. Now these stats work just as you would expect on a normal rocket launcher. Blast radius increasing or decreasing your explosion blast radius based on your stat number. Velocity increasing or decreasing how fast the rocket travels. Now I know on grenade launchers, your damage numbers can change based on your velocity and your blast radius. But during our testing, it seems to work just like a rocket launcher would, giving us consistent damage numbers across the board. Now speaking of damage, at Carl against red bar enemies, Indebted Kindness was doing 5,325 to the body and only 6,421 to the head. But it's that additional explosive damage that really amps things up. 24,590 damage. This gives us a total of 31,011 damage against minor enemies if you land a crit. Although it really doesn't matter, guys, just land the hit. Now against Carl, we were doing 3,821 per body and 4,608 per crit, plus 17,646 explosive damage. This gives us a total of 22,254 damage versus Carl. Really not bad damage when you consider the ammo economy. Now throughout our testing, it seems like you're able to hit max damage up to over 50 meters. Granted, it gets to a certain point where you just don't want to shoot from too far away. It's projectiles, guys. Even if it's a big target, you could still miss. Now, how does this compare with other sidearms? Now, Drain versus Carl, we're doing 3,177 per body and 4,454 per crit. Now, this, of course, is not a good comparison considering that this is a primary weapon and Indebted Kindness is a special weapon. So the obvious comparison really needs to be against Forerunner. Forerunner is our only other special sidearm. But versus Carl, Forerunner does 3,754 per body and 19,557 per crit. Now, Forerunner, although a little niche inside of PvE, has been a decent choice. But as you can see here, Indebted Kindness is beating it out, doing 22,254 damage against Carl versus Forerunner's 19,557. Now keep in mind, Forerunner is also a kinetic weapon, so it's getting that additional damage. Now, rate of fire, of course, makes a big difference. DPS-wise, Indebted Kindness really sits at an optimal DPS of 37,090, whereas Forerunner sits at 65,190. Total damage for Forerunner is also 1,408,104, where Indebted Kindness sits at about 1.25. Now, some things to keep in mind, Forerunner has a lot more ammo than Indebted Kindness, but most importantly, Forerunner relies heavily on crits. If you land a body shot, you're losing 75% of your damage. So in a live game, chances of you being 100% accurate probably isn't gonna happen. But considering Indebted Kindness and its damage is really tied to that explosive damage, and there's not a big deviation in landing crits to body, there's a lot more forgiveness with our dungeon sidearm. Now, when comparing it to, say, other special weapons in terms of total damage, just bumping around the board here, aggressive snipers around 754,460 damage, high impact fusions around 981,240 damage, slug shotguns pretty much the same as aggressives at 767,000 damage. The point is that Indebted Kindness and its ammo economy has really good total damage with the ability to almost use this sidearm as a primary. Now, obviously, these other specials have more DPS. The point is that you don't use this sidearm for DPS. you use it as like a souped up primary. Now, before we get into the perks, I do want to talk about how this weapon feels, considering it's such an odd one. Personally, in PvP, I don't like it, guys. I know. Yes, it can get the 2-tap, but it just doesn't feel good to me. Even with roles like Impulse Amplifier or perhaps even Beacon Rounds, I don't like it. And again, that's just my experience. It's a cool weapon, and I wish we could utilize it more in PvP, but as of now, I'm just not that crazy about it. And in terms of like tracking, yes, Beacon Rounds is really nice, but I would argue and say no sidearm beats Drake's Promise in the tracking department. And until we get that sidearm back, even the new exotic sidearm from the dungeon, they're all just kind of living in the shadow of Drake's Promise, at least from a PvP perspective. The tracking with Drake's was just too good. Granted, you have to be within sidearm range, but you shred it within sidearm range. So for PvP, guys, for me personally, it's a no-go. For PvE, this thing surprisingly puts out. First up, the archetype is just a fun weapon to use, whereas its tracking and of course landing the projectile in PvP is extremely punishing. Inside of PvE, it's much more manageable. It dishes out solid damage. It had no problem taking on majority of enemies. And when you pair it with anti-barrier sidearm, it makes pretty quick work of barrier champions inside of Nightfalls. The only problem that you're gonna have to remember with this sidearm is that it is a special weapon. Although its ammo economy is good and you can build into that, there are times that you'll suddenly realize you're out of ammo. Now, of course, the real question is how is it gonna hold up in Grandmasters? I don't know. We're gonna have to just see. I will say though, there is an exotic that just got a rework that seems to be built for this sidearm, and that's the Hunter exotic Mechaneer's Tricksleeves. This got a massive buff this season. Bungie essentially lifted the ease of use of this exotic, making its bonus now active for 5 seconds once your shields begin to recharge, and getting kills will extend the timer by 3 seconds. Now granted, you need to be in the red to get this perk, but obviously in like things like a GM, and considering you're on a Hunter, that won't be that hard. But you can do some serious damage with Indebted Kindness plus Mechaneer's Tricksleeves. Against Carl, it was doing 7,641 per body and 9,215 to the head, with our explosive damage getting buffed by Tricksleeves, increasing up to 35,292. Now this is a total damage of 44,507 if you land a crit. Do not sleep on Tricksleeves for this, guys. Considering the AoE and explosive damage, you can actually carry that buff for a decent amount of time with Tricksleeves, way easier than what you could before. Keep in mind, you can rock double sidearms. You could do like a Traveler's Chosen in your kinetic slot and then swap to this sidearm and continue to carry and chain Tricksleeves. Now, Les actually recommended a build which takes advantage of Geomag stabilizers, which in case you forgot, got a buff last season. It's actually really good for Arc Warlocks. Now, the basic gist of this build is to get as many Onic traces as possible. This gives us super energy back really fast, also contributes to our abilities, and the aspect Electrostatic Mine helps us do this as defeating targets with arc abilities or defeating jolted or blinded targets will create an Onic trace for us. Now for fragments, we have Spark of Discharge, where arc weapon final blows have a chance to create an Onic trace. Spark of Ions, where defeating jolted targets creates an Onic trace, and we also have Spark of Beacons, as well as Amplitude, which synergize very nicely. Now the role that we've been using is the one I highly recommend, Volt Shot. That's right, guys. You can get this sidearm with Volt Shot. Now you don't need it, but it definitely helps. It was a really nice build though, guys. And we had something similar last season with Cold Heart, except Cold Heart takes up your exotic slot. This sidearm doesn't. And considering we have anti-barrier sidearm, why not? Now speaking of perks, we need to talk about the God role for Indebted Kindness. Considering it's a rocket sidearm combo, its magazine perks are very interesting because you can roll rocket magazine perks. Things like high velocity rounds, implosion rounds, high explosive ordnance, which I know you've only really seen that on grenade launchers, but keep in mind, it used to roll on rocket launchers. If you remember the button as well as pit launcher, both of those had a static roll with high explosive ordnance as an option. Now, before you ask, does impact casing roll on this rocket launcher? Again, at the making of this video, we don't have complete API access to the sidearm, but as far as I've seen, no. And I mean, we've checked everywhere. It doesn't appear that impact casing, which by the way, increases damage on direct hits, similar to like spike grenades, but for rocket launchers, that perk does not seem to be on this sidearm. But it is interesting that Bungie's giving us rocket launcher magazine perks. Makes this weapon even quirkier. Now, in our third column, we have Lead from Gold, Impulse Amplifier, Offense Strike, Inline Action, Loose Change, and Beacon Rounds. Now, over on our fourth column, we have Surrounded, Adagio, Volt Shot, Attrition Orbs, Deconstruct, and Permeability. Now, for my PvE players, I'm just gonna say Volt Shot felt amazing. Not only did it do good damage, but the ad clearing ability with it in tandem with the chunky damage you're putting out was really nice. Now, considering you are using a sidearm, and if you're just trying to get chunky damage, you can do Adagio, or hell, even Surrounded, as Surrounded will give you a hefty buff, and you can just go in, chew down the chunky boy's verse, and then clear out the ads with a primary weapon. Now, I'm gonna talk about about beacon rounds for just a moment. This perk reads, final blows with this weapon grant your projectiles tracking, and dealing further damage extends the duration. Now the tracking here is pretty aggressive. I've seen people using it in PvP as well, but of course you got to get a kill to activate this. Now whether or not you want to use this over say like lead from gold, which would of course net you more ammo, it depends on the activity, right? Having that tracking could be really nice, especially in harder content where you're peeking in and out of cover. Now I did use an impulse amplifier roll, which of course increases projectile velocity. Now impulse amplifier is like the go-to perk on grenade launchers for PvP. It is a very good perk. It also helps with reload speed. I will say impulse amplifier makes this sidearm almost feel like a hit scan weapon. Keep in mind though, once you reach a certain point in range, even impulse amplifier won't amp things up where it's instantaneous damage. And that's just because of travel time. Now for the origin trait that is on all of these dungeon weapons, we have Sundering. Destroying vehicles and constructs grant this weapon bonus reload speed and charge rates. Constructs includes barricades, turrets, stasis crystals, and other objects created in the field. Still trying to figure out how we're gonna really utilize this origin trait, and it really just depends on the encounter, but otherwise kinda useless on this sidearm. So guys, that is our review for Indebted Kindness. Now for my PvP players that are probably jumping up and down saying, Cross, this weapon's a monster. It can kill guardians in 2 body shots on tier 1 resilience, or 1 crit 1 body up to tier 7 resilience, and tier 8 and above, it can do it in 2 crits. How can you not like this sidearm? Guys, I'm just telling you, I wasn't a fan of it. In 1v1 duels, I felt like this weapon really dropped off. I felt like it couldn't handle flinch well. And then of course, having that projectile, you have to land it. You've got travel time in there. Even with an impulse amplifier roll or even beacon rounds, I felt like this thing struggled. Yes, beacon rounds is nice, but you got to get a kill to activate it. An impulse amplifier kind of made it a hit scan in a way, but then you reach a certain range where it definitely didn't feel that way. I just feel like this weapon is not meant for PvP. Granted, if you love using this in PvP, guys, go all out. But for my PvE players, and surprisingly, for my Gambit players, I would definitely give this one a go. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.